Have you ever been stared at for something you couldn't control? Something that made you feel like you didn't belong anywhere you went? For 25-year-old Mira Chan, those piercing blue eyes that should have been beautiful became her curse the moment she stepped foot in Seoul. The genetics were a cruel joke. Her Korean mother's delicate features paired with some distant European ancestors' gift had resulted in eyes the color of winter sky, startling against her otherwise perfectly Asian appearance. In America, she'd been too Asian. In Korea, she was too foreign. And tonight, running through the rain-slicked streets of Hongdae with her heart hammering against her ribs, those blue eyes might just get her killed. Mira pressed herself against the brick wall of the narrow alley, her breath coming in sharp puffs that fogged in the cold November air. She shouldn't be here. She should have taken the main road back to her tiny studio apartment like any sensible English teacher would after a late tutoring session. But the shortcut through the backstreets had seemed harmless enough until she'd heard the shouting. Korean voices, sharp with anger and something darker. Violence. She peered around the corner and immediately wished she hadn't. 5 men surrounded 2 others in the dim circle of a flickering streetlight. The math wasn't good. The 2 in the center were well-dressed, expensive suits now torn and bloodied. The 5 surrounding them wore all black, their faces hard with the kind of cold purpose that made Myra's stomach clench with fear. This wasn't a random mugging. This was professional. She should run. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around and pretend she'd never seen anything. But as one of the men in black raised what looked like a metal pipe, Myra's hand was already fumbling for her phone. She'd been raised by a mother who'd fled Korea to escape violence, who'd taught her daughter that sometimes the right thing to do was also the most dangerous thing. Her fingers shook as she dialed the emergency number, whispering in Korean as quietly as she could manage. But apparently not quietly enough. One of the attackers spun toward her hiding spot, his eyes scanning the shadows. Myra's breath caught in her throat as his gaze swept past her once, then snapped back. He'd seen her. He barked something to his companions and started toward the alley where she hid. Mira stumbled backward, her phone clattering to the wet pavement. She should have minded her own business. She should have kept walking. She should have done anything except what she'd actually done, which was apparently sign her own death warrant. But as the man in black reached the mouth of the alley, a voice cut through the night like a blade. The command was in Korean, sharp and absolute. The kind of voice that expected instant obedience and usually got it. Mira couldn't see who had spoken, but the effect on her pursuer was immediate. He froze mid-step, then slowly turned back toward the main confrontation. Mira pressed herself deeper into the shadows and finally got a clear look at who had spoken. One of the well-dressed men had managed to stand despite the blood trickling from a cut above his eye. He was tall for a Korean man, probably 6 feet, with the kind of presence that commanded attention even when he was outnumbered and bleeding. His hair was styled with the precision of someone who cared about appearances, though it was disheveled now from the fight. Even from her hiding spot, Mira could see the sharp cut of his jaw, the expensive watch glinting on his wrist despite the circumstances. He said something else in rapid Korean, too fast and low for Mira to catch, but whatever it was made the attackers exchange uncertain glances. The man's companion, stockier but equally well-dressed, had produced something from his jacket. The attackers were backing away now, their aggressive formation dissolving into something more like retreat. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Myra's phone call had worked, even if she'd dropped the phone before giving them a proper location. Someone had triangulated the call, or maybe another witness had reported the disturbance. Either way, help was coming. The 5 attackers melted away into the maze of backstreets with the fluid efficiency of people who knew how to disappear. Within moments, the alley was empty except for the 2 bloodied men and Mira, still pressed against her brick wall like she could somehow become part of it. The tall man straightened his jacket with the kind of casual precision that suggested this wasn't his first violent encounter. His companion was speaking urgently in Korean, gesturing toward where the attackers had vanished, but the tall man wasn't looking in that direction. He was looking directly at Myra's hiding spot. Those dark eyes found hers across the dim space between buildings, and Mira felt something electric shoot down her spine. He'd known she was there the entire time, known she was watching, known she'd called for help, known exactly where she was hiding. And instead of being angry about her interference, He looked almost amused. He took a step toward her, then another. Mira knew she should run, but her feet seemed rooted to the wet pavement. Everything about this man suggested danger, from the expensive clothes that couldn't quite hide the lean strength of his frame to the casual way he'd faced down 5 attackers. But there was something else in his approach, something careful and deliberate rather than threatening. He stopped just outside the alley's mouth and spoke in perfect English with only the faintest accent. "You can come out now. They're gone." Myra's throat felt dry as sandpaper. How did he know she spoke English? How did he know anything about her? She stepped forward on unsteady legs, her hands clenched into fists at her sides to hide their trembling. "You're hurt," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need medical attention." The man's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it had reached his eyes. Instead, those dark eyes were studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. She forced herself to maintain eye contact, even as her cheeks warmed under his scrutiny. "I'll live. The question is what happens to you now?" The sirens were getting closer, maybe 2 blocks away. Mira glanced toward the sound, then back at the man. His companion had moved closer, speaking in urgent Korean that definitely sounded like they needed to leave immediately. "I don't understand," Mira said. "You helped us. That makes you a witness. In my line of work, witnesses can be problematic. But you..." His gaze sharpened, focusing on her face with an intensity that made her stomach flutter despite her fear. "You have unusual eyes." Heat flooded Myra's cheeks. Here it was again, the thing that had made her an outsider her entire life. She'd been stared at, commented on, and whispered about more times than she could count. Korean students giggled behind their hands when they saw her. Strangers on the subway did double takes. Market vendors asked intrusive questions about her parentage. She was used to being examined like some kind of genetic curiosity. But this man wasn't looking at her like she was an oddity. He was looking at her like she was something precious. "Blue eyes in Korea," he murmured, more to himself than to her. His companion said something sharp in Korean, and the man nodded absently without taking his gaze off Myra's face. "My grandmother would say this is an omen." The police sirens were close enough now that Mira could see the red and blue lights reflecting off the wet streets. The man's companion grabbed his arm, speaking urgently. They needed to leave, and they needed to leave now. But the tall man didn't move. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, extending it toward Mira. She hesitated for a moment before taking it, her fingers brushing against his. Even that brief contact sent warmth shooting up her arm. The card was thick, expensive stock with Korean characters she couldn't read and an English name printed below. Kong Jiwon, Business Development. "If anyone asks you about tonight, you saw nothing. Understood?" Mira nodded, clutching the card against her palm. The sirens were on the next street over. "But if you need anything," Kong Jiwon continued, his voice dropping to something lower, more intimate, "call that number. Day or night." He turned to leave with his companion, but paused at the mouth of the alley. "What's your name?" "Mira. Mira-chun. Mira." He repeated it like he was testing how it felt on his tongue. "Stay safe, Mira-chun with the blue eyes. Seoul can be dangerous for someone who stands out." Then he was gone, vanishing into the maze of backstreets with the same fluid efficiency as their attackers. Mira stood alone in the alley, holding a stranger's business card and trying to process what had just happened. The police arrived 3 minutes later, finding nothing but wet pavement and a young woman who claimed she'd heard shouting but seen nothing useful. They took her statement with the weary professionalism of officers who dealt with non-helpful witnesses regularly and told her to call if she remembered anything else. Mira walked home through the neon-bright streets of Hongdae, her mind spinning. She should throw away the business card. She should forget this ever happened. She should go back to her quiet life of teaching English and trying not to attract attention. Instead, she found herself thinking about the way Kong Jiwon had said her name and the strange warmth in his eyes when he'd looked at her blue ones. For the first time in her life, someone had seen the thing that made her different and called it an omen instead of an oddity. She was still thinking about it when she finally fell asleep 3 hours later, the business card tucked safely in her wallet. Mira thought she'd dreamed the entire encounter until her phone rang at 6 in the morning. She fumbled for the device in the gray dawn light filtering through her apartment's single window, squinting at the unknown number on the screen. Part of her wanted to ignore it, To pretend that last night had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many late tutoring sessions and too little sleep. But she answered anyway. Miss Chen. The voice was unmistakably Kong Jaiwan's, that same careful English with its slight accent. I need you to listen very carefully. Mira sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. How did you get my number? Phone records aren't difficult to access when you know the right people. He paused, and she could hear voices in the background, rapid Korean spoken in urgent tones. The men from last night weren't random criminals. They work for someone who doesn't appreciate interference in his business. What does that have to do with me? But even as Mira asked the question, her stomach was already sinking with the answer she didn't want to hear. You were seen helping us. That makes you a target. Get dressed and pack whatever you can't live without. I'm sending someone to collect you in 20 minutes. Wait, what? Mira scrambled out of bed, her heart racing. I can't just disappear. I have students. I have responsibilities. I have a life here. You'll have a death here if you stay. The bluntness of his words cut through her protests. 20 minutes, Miss Chun. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The line went dead. Mira stared at her phone for 10 seconds before the reality of her situation crashed over her. This was really happening. She'd gotten involved in something dangerous, and now her quiet little life and soul was about to disappear, whether she wanted it to or not. She threw clothes into a backpack with shaking hands, grabbed her passport and the small emergency fund she kept hidden behind her rice cooker. Her hands hesitated over the business card on her nightstand before she slipped it into her wallet. If she was about to trust her life to a stranger, she might as well keep his contact information close. The knock on her door came exactly 20 minutes later. Soft but insistent. A young Korean man stood in her hallway, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of casual alertness that suggested he was used to watching for trouble. He looked completely ordinary except for his eyes, which swept her apartment's interior with professional thoroughness before settling on her face. Miss Chen, I'm Taehyun. I work for Jawansi. Are you ready? Mira shouldered her backpack and took one last look at the studio apartment that had been home for 8 months. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Or had been hers, until she'd decided to play Good Samaritan in a back alley. I'm ready, she lied. The drive across Seoul took 40 minutes through morning traffic that Taehyun navigated with the fluid skill of someone intimately familiar with the city's rhythms. Mira stared out the window at the familiar streets, wondering if she'd ever see them again as a free woman. Was this what kidnapping felt like? This strange combination of voluntary compliance and absolute lack of choice? The safe house turned out to be a sleek apartment in Gangnam, the kind of place that screamed expensive even from the lobby. Taehyun led her through a private elevator to the 15th floor, where he knocked on a door in a pattern that was definitely some kind of code. Kong Jaiwan opened the door himself. In daylight, Mira could see details she'd missed the night before. The small scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The way his dark hair was styled with mathematical precision. The expensive watch that matched his expensive shoes and expensive shirt. Everything about him suggested wealth and power, from the way he moved with casual confidence to the deference in Taehyun's posture. But it was his eyes that held her attention. Those same dark eyes that had studied her so intently in the alley, now examining her face with what looked almost like relief. You came, he said, as if her arrival had been in doubt. Did I have a choice? There's always a choice. His lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. You could have run. Tried to disappear on your own. Most people would have. Mira followed him into the apartment, her backpack feeling suddenly heavy on her shoulders. The space was modern and minimalist, all clean lines and neutral colors that probably cost more than she made in a year. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Seoul's skyline that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. Most people aren't English teachers who call the police when they see someone getting beaten up in an alley, she pointed out. No, Jaiwan agreed, gesturing for her to sit on the leather sofa that probably cost more than her monthly rent. They're not. 3 other men occupied the apartment's living room, all Korean, all with the same alert watchfulness she'd noticed in Taehyun. They looked up when she entered, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. One of them, a stocky man in his 30s with scarred knuckles, said something in rapid Korean that made the others chuckle. Jaiwan's response was sharp enough to kill the laughter immediately. What did he say? Mira asked, though she suspected she didn't really want to know. Seekjin was wondering if all foreigners have such unusual eyes, or if you're special. I told him you're under my protection, and anyone who disrespects you answers to me personally. The weight behind his words was unmistakable. Whatever Kong Jaiwan's position in his organization, it was high enough that his men took his threats very seriously. Mira sank onto the sofa, the reality of her situation finally settling in her chest like a cold stone. I don't understand any of this. Last night you were just someone who needed help. Now you're talking about protection and safe houses like you're some kind of crime boss. Jaiwan finished for her. The term seemed to amuse him. I prefer to think of myself as a businessman with diverse interests. That's what every criminal says. True, but not every criminal would go to this much trouble to keep a witness safe. His eyes found hers again, that same intense focus that made her stomach flutter despite her fear. Especially not a witness whose testimony could cause him significant problems. Then why are you helping me? Jaiwan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her eyes to the rest of her face and back again. Because my grandmother raised me to believe that some encounters are more than coincidence. Blue eyes in Korea, helping at the exact moment we needed help most. She would call you a sign. A sign of what? Protection, good fortune, change. He shrugged slightly, as if embarrassed by his own superstition. She's very traditional about these things. One of the men called something from the kitchen in Korean. Jaiwan responded, then turned back to Mira. Are you hungry? Minseek is making breakfast. I don't think I could eat anything right now. You should try. It might be a long day. The breakfast was simple but delicious. Rice, kimchi, grilled fish, and soup that warmed her from the inside out. Mira found herself eating more than she'd expected, her body overriding her anxiety's attempts to shut down her appetite. The men ate with the casual efficiency of people used to grabbing meals between more pressing concerns, but she noticed they kept glancing at her when they thought she wasn't looking. Finally, the one called Seekjin said something in Korean that made the others laugh again. This time, Jaiwan's expression was more amused than annoyed. What now? Mira asked. He wants to know if your blue eyes really bring luck, or if it's just superstition. What did you tell him? That we'll find out. After breakfast, the apartment settled into a waiting pattern that felt both tense and mundane. The men cleaned weapons with the casual attention of professionals maintaining their tools. Jaiwan spent an hour on the phone speaking rapid Korean, his voice moving between casual conversation and sharp commands depending on who he was talking to. Mira sat by the windows and watched Seoul spread out below her, trying not to think about how her students would react when she didn't show up for their lessons. By afternoon, restlessness was making her fidget. She'd read the same page of her book 3 times without absorbing a single word. How long do we have to stay here? She asked Jaiwan during a break in his phone calls. Until it's safe for you to leave. And when will that be? When the people who want to hurt you are no longer capable of doing so. The matter-of-fact way he said it made her shiver. You're going to kill them. I'm going to resolve the situation. The details of how aren't something you need to worry about. Mira stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. I can't just sit here while you plan someone's murder on my behalf. This is insane. You'd prefer I let them kill you instead? I'd prefer none of this had happened. She turned to face him, frustration and fear making her voice sharper than intended. I'd prefer to go back to my boring life teaching English and pretending I belong somewhere. You don't belong in Seoul? Jaiwan's question was genuinely curious rather than challenging. Do I look like I belong? Mira gestured at her own face, at the blue eyes that had marked her as different her entire life. I've been stared at every day since I arrived. People whisper about me on the subway. My students think I'm fascinating instead of taking me seriously because I look like some kind of genetic experiment. But you stayed. Where else was I supposed to go? America thinks I'm too Korean. Korea thinks I'm too foreign. At least here I can make a living. Jaiwan studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. I lost my parents when I was 12. Car accident that wasn't really an accident, if you understand my meaning. My grandmother raised me after that, but she was old-fashioned. Believed in signs, in fate, in the importance of honoring your ancestors and protecting your family. Mira found herself sitting back down, drawn by something vulnerable in his voice. She also believed that sometimes outsiders see things more clearly than people who've always belonged. That being different isn't a weakness if you learn to use it as strength. Is that supposed to make me feel better about being a freak? You're not a freak. His voice was firm enough to make her look up. You're unusual. In a city of 10 million people who all look roughly the same, you stand out. That could be a liability, or it could be an advantage, depending on how you choose to see it. How is being stared at an advantage? Because people remember you. Because you make an impression. Because in my world, being memorable can be the difference between life and death. Before Mira could ask what he meant by that, Taehyun appeared in the doorway with his phone in hand. He spoke rapidly in Korean, his expression serious. Jaewon listened, his jaw tightening with whatever he was hearing. What's wrong? Mira asked. Your apartment was searched this afternoon. Thoroughly. The cold stone in her chest turned to ice. They were really looking for me. Yes. Which means staying here tonight was the right choice. His eyes found hers again, and she saw something protective flickering in their depths. I won't let anything happen to you, Mira. I give you my word. Why? The question came out smaller than she'd intended. Why do you care what happens to me? Jaewon was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that she had to lean forward to hear him clearly. Because when I saw you in that alley, blue eyes wide with fear but still brave enough to help strangers, I thought my grandmother might be right. Maybe some encounters really are meant to happen. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't move, his fingers touched her chin gently, tilting her face up so he could see her eyes clearly. And maybe some people are meant to find each other, even in the most unlikely circumstances. Mira felt her breath catch as his thumb brushed across her lower lip. The touch was feather-light but sent warmth shooting through her entire body. This close, she could smell his cologne, could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could feel the careful control in the way he touched her. She wanted to lean into that touch, wanted to close the distance between them and find out if his mouth was as gentle as his hands. The wanting was sudden and intense enough to make her dizzy. But before either of them could move, Taehyun's voice cut through the moment from the hallway. Sharp Korean words that made Jaewon's hand drop away from her face immediately. Security alert, he explained, already moving toward the door. Stay here. He was gone before she could ask what kind of alert, leaving her alone in the expensive apartment with her racing heart and the lingering scent of his cologne. Through the windows, Seoul glittered in the gathering dusk, beautiful and dangerous and full of possibilities she'd never imagined when she'd first stepped off the plane 8 months ago. Mira touched her lip where his thumb had been and realized that somewhere between this morning's panic and this evening's almost kiss, she'd stopped wanting to run away from Kang Jaewon. Maybe that should have scared her more than it did. The security alert turned out to be nothing more than a suspicious van parked too long across the street, but it was enough to keep Mira awake most of the night. She lay on the guest room's expensive sheets, staring at the ceiling and replaying the moment when Jaewon's thumb had brushed her lip. The memory sent heat coursing through her body even now, hours later. She was still tired when Jaewon knocked on her door the next morning, but the exhaustion evaporated the moment she saw his expression. My grandmother wants to meet you, he said without preamble. Mira blinked, still processing the shift from yesterday's almost kiss to today's family introductions. Your grandmother? She heard about you. About your eyes. She's very insistent about these things. An hour later, Mira found herself in the back of Jaewon's car as they drove through a quieter neighborhood in Bukshan, where traditional Hanok houses nestled between modern developments. The area felt older, more rooted in history than the gleaming towers of Gangnam. Tell me about her, Mira said as they pulled up outside a modest house with a traditional tiled roof. She's 83 and sharper than most people half her age. She raised me after my parents died, and she has very strong opinions about fate and fortune. Jaewon's expression softened in a way Mira hadn't seen before. She's also the most important person in my life, so her approval matters. What if she doesn't approve of me? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But she will. The certainty in his voice made something warm unfurl in Myra's chest. When had his opinion of her started to matter so much? Jaewon's grandmother was tiny, barely reaching Myra's shoulder, but she radiated the kind of presence that filled a room. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a traditional hanbok in deep blue silk that made her look both elegant and formidable. But it was her eyes that struck Mira most. Dark and intelligent, they fixed on Myra's face the moment she walked through the door, studying her with an intensity that reminded her strongly of her grandson. "Ah," the grandmother said in accented but clear English. "Blue eyes. Come here, child." Mira approached cautiously, unsure of the protocol for meeting Korean crime bosses' grandmothers. But the older woman simply reached up and cupped Myra's face in both hands, her weathered fingers surprisingly gentle. "Beautiful," she murmured, examining Myra's eyes like precious stones. "My late husband had eyes like these. Very rare. Very blessed." "Blessed?" Mira repeated. The grandmother released her face and gestured for them to sit around the low table that dominated the room. She moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to accommodate old bones without compromising dignity. "In our family, we believe blue eyes carry protection. My husband survived 3 wars and 40 years in dangerous business because of his unusual eyes. Our enemies thought he was cursed. Our allies thought he was lucky. Either way, they remembered him." She poured tea from a delicate porcelain set, her movements practiced and graceful despite her age. "When Jaiwan told me about you, about how you appeared when he needed help most, I knew you were meant for him. Signs are not coincidences, child. They are messages from ancestors who watch over us." Mira accepted the tea with both hands. The way she'd been taught was polite in Korean culture. "I'm not sure I believe in signs." "You don't have to believe," the grandmother said with a small smile. "They work whether you believe or not. But it helps if you understand their value." She turned to Jaiwan and spoke in rapid Korean. Mira caught a few words about protection and family, but the conversation was too fast for her limited Korean to follow. Whatever his grandmother was saying, it made Jaiwan's expression shift from respectful attention to something that looked almost like embarrassment. "She wants to know if I'm treating you with proper respect," he translated finally. "What did you tell her?" "That respect takes time to build, but some foundations are stronger than others." The afternoon passed in a blur of family stories and traditional Korean customs that Jaiwan's grandmother seemed determined to share. Mira learned about ancestral shrines and protection rituals, about the significance of dreams and the importance of honoring family bonds. It was unlike anything she'd experienced growing up with her thoroughly Americanized mother. But it was when the grandmother showed her the family shrine, with its photographs of deceased relatives and carefully maintained offerings, that Mira felt something shift inside her chest. "This is Jaiwan's grandfather," the grandmother said, pointing to a faded photograph of a stern-looking man with piercing blue eyes. "And this is his father." The resemblance between Jaiwan and his father was striking, but it was the grandfather's eyes that made Myra's breath catch. They were exactly the same shade of blue as her own. "He would have liked you very much," the grandmother said quietly. "You have the same strength in your eyes that he did. The same willingness to stand when others would run." "I'm not strong," Mira protested. "I'm just stubborn." Sometimes they are the same thing. They left the grandmother's house as the sun was setting, the older woman pressing a small wrapped package into Myra's hands with instructions to open it later. The drive back toward Gangnam was quieter than the morning trip, both of them processing the afternoon's revelations. "She likes you," Jaiwan said finally as they stopped at a red light. "How can you tell?" "She gave you something from the family shrine. She only does that for people she considers family." Myra's fingers tightened on the small package. Family. When was the last time she'd felt like she belonged to something larger than herself? They were halfway back to the safe house when Jaiwan's phone rang. He answered in Korean, his voice casual at first, then sharp with alarm. The conversation was brief and intense. "What's wrong?" Mira asked as he ended the call. "Change of plans. We're making a stop first." Instead of heading back to the apartment, Jaiwan directed the driver toward a traditional market in Hongdae. The evening crowds were thick, vendors calling out prices for everything from fresh fish to handmade crafts. "Why are we here?" Mira asked as they got out of the car. "Testing a theory. Stay close to me." They'd barely made it 20 feet into the market when Mira spotted them. 3 men in dark clothing, moving through the crowd with too much purpose. They weren't shopping. They were hunting. "Jaiwan," she said quietly. "I see them." His hand found the small of her back, guiding her toward a narrow alley between vendor stalls. But as they reached the entrance, 2 more men emerged from the shadows. "Run," Jaiwan said. But there was nowhere to run. The men closed in with the coordinated efficiency of a trap well-planned and perfectly executed. Mira felt strong hands grab her arms, felt herself being lifted off her feet despite her struggles. Then Jaiwan moved. She'd seen him confident and controlled, had glimpsed the danger beneath his polished exterior. But this was the first time she'd seen him truly violent. He moved like water and struck like lightning, taking down two men before the third could fully process what was happening. The hands holding Mira released her as their owner turned to face this new threat. She stumbled backward against a vendor stall, her heart hammering as she watched Jaiwan fight with the fluid precision of someone who'd learned violence as a survival skill. It was over in less than 2 minutes. The attackers melted away into the crowd, carrying their wounded and leaving no trace except for Myra's racing pulse and the predatory satisfaction in Jaiwan's eyes as he scanned the market for additional threats. "Are you hurt?" His hands were on her face, her shoulders, checking for damage with the thorough attention of someone genuinely worried. "I'm fine." But her voice shook, betraying the lie. She wasn't fine. She was terrified and exhilarated and completely out of her depth. Back to the car. Now, the drive to the safe house was silent except for Jaiwan's clipped Korean as he made phone calls to increase security. Mira sat beside him and tried to process what had just happened. Someone had tried to kidnap her. Actually tried to take her off the street like she was some kind of commodity. By the time they reached the apartment, reaction was setting in. Myra's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her teacup, and her throat felt tight with unshed tears. "You saved my life," she said when Jaiwan finally finished his security calls. "It's what I do." "No, this is different. You risked yourself for me." "Why?" Jaiwan was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with that same intensity she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "Because the thought of someone hurting you makes me want to destroy things." The honesty in his voice made her chest tight. "When did you become so important to me?" She whispered. "I was wondering the same thing about you." They were sitting on the sofa, close enough that she could see the small cut on his knuckle from the fight, close enough to smell his cologne mixed with adrenaline, close enough that when he reached out to touch her cheek, she could feel the slight tremor in his fingers. "Tell me about your eyes," he said softly. "Tell me why you think they make you a freak instead of a miracle." The request broke something loose inside her chest. Before she could stop herself, the words were spilling out. Stories about elementary school children who'd called her a ghost. Teenagers who'd whispered that she was adopted because she couldn't possibly be her mother's real daughter. College classmates who'd treated her like an exotic pet instead of a person. "I've never belonged anywhere," she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "Too Korean for America, too foreign for Korea. These eyes make me a curiosity instead of a person." When she finally looked up, Jaiwan's expression was fierce with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "My parents died because they trusted the wrong people," he said quietly. "Car accident arranged by rivals who wanted to eliminate competition. I was 12 years old, and suddenly I was alone except for an old woman who saw omens in tea leaves and protection spells in blue eyes." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with gentle pressure. "For 20 years, I've used her superstitions as armor. Every dangerous situation I've survived, every enemy I've outlasted, I told myself it was because I honored her beliefs about fate and fortune. But when I saw you in that alley, blue eyes wide with fear, but still brave enough to help strangers." He paused, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "I realized I'd been waiting my whole life for you to appear." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross. Mira felt her breath catch as Jaiwan's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "I'm falling for you," he said simply. "Not because of superstition or good luck or whatever my grandmother believes. Because you're brave and kind and beautiful, and when you look at me, I feel like I might actually deserve something good in my life." When he kissed her, it was nothing like the desperate passion she'd read about in romance novels. It was slow and careful and achingly tender, like he was trying to memorize the moment. His lips moved against hers with reverent attention, and when she responded by sliding her fingers into his hair, the small sound he made against her mouth sent heat spiraling through her entire body. She could taste the lingering adrenaline from their escape, could feel the careful control in the way his hands framed her face. This was a man who knew how to take what he wanted, but he was choosing gentleness instead. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jaiwan rested his forehead against hers. "Stay with me tonight," he said. Not because it's safer, though it is. Because I don't want to let you out of my sight. Myra's answer was to kiss him again, pouring all her confusion and attraction and growing trust into the connection between them. Whatever this was, whatever they were becoming, she wanted to find out together. In the back of her mind, she could hear Jaiwan's grandmother talking about signs and fate, and the protection that came from being exactly where you were meant to be. Maybe, for the first time in her life, she was starting to believe. Detective Park arrived at 8 in the morning with an offer that should have been everything Mira wanted. Police protection, he explained in careful English, setting his coffee cup on the apartment's expensive table. Safe house under government supervision. New identity, if necessary. All you have to do is testify about what you witnessed, and we can end this. Mira sat beside Jaiwan on the sofa, acutely aware of his stillness as he listened to the detective's proposal. His face revealed nothing, but she could feel the tension radiating from his body like heat. Think about it carefully, Miss Chun, Detective Park continued. These people are dangerous. The life they're offering you isn't safety, it's deeper involvement in criminal activity. We can give you a way out. What kind of testimony would you need? Mira asked. Details about the organizations involved, their activities, their leadership structure. The detective's eyes shifted meaningfully toward Jaiwan. Everything you've learned during your time in their protection. So you want me to betray the people who saved my life. We want you to help us prevent more violence. Mira looked at Jaiwan, searching his expression for some hint of what he wanted her to do. But his face remained carefully neutral, giving her nothing except the slightest nod that seemed to say the choice was entirely hers. I need some time to think about it, she said finally. Detective Park stood, leaving his business card beside his empty coffee cup. 24 hours, Miss Chun. After that, we may not be able to guarantee the same level of protection. After he left, the apartment fell into heavy silence. Jaiwan's men resumed their casual activities, but Mira could feel their attention focused on her like a weight. Are you going to take his offer? Jaiwan asked quietly. Are you going to ask me not to? No. If you want to leave, I'll make sure you get out safely. No retribution, no complications. The matter-of-fact way he said it made something twist in her chest. Just like that? Just like that. His dark eyes found hers, and she saw something vulnerable flickering in their depths. But I hope you'll stay. Why? Because I think you're starting to see what I see when I look at you. And because I'm selfish enough to want you to choose me over safety. Mira studied his face, memorizing the sharp line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the small scar that cut through his eyebrow. 24 hours ago, she would have taken the detective's offer without hesitation. Now the thought of never seeing Jaiwan again made her chest tight with panic. I'm staying, she said. The relief that crossed his face was so profound it made her heart skip. He reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips to press a soft kiss against her knuckles. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Mira said. If I'm going to be part of this, I want to actually be part of it. No more sitting on the sidelines while you handle everything. Jaiwan's expression shifted to something that looked like concern mixed with admiration. What did you have in mind? An hour later, Mira found herself in an impromptu strategy meeting with Jaiwan's core team. Taehyun had spread building blueprints across the dining table, while Seekjin cleaned his gun with the casual attention of someone maintaining familiar equipment. Minseek monitored 3 different phones, fielding calls and updates about rival movements throughout the city. The target is Kim Young-ho, Jaiwan explained, pointing to surveillance photos of a hard-faced man in his 50s. He runs the organization that's been targeting you. Traditional approach would be direct confrontation, but his security is extensive. What if he used me as bait? Mira asked. The room went dead silent. Taehyun looked up from his blueprints with obvious alarm, while Seekjin's hands stilled on his weapon. Absolutely not, Jaiwan said flatly. Hear me out. I'm what he wants, right? The witness who can identify his people. What if I appeared to surrender myself, but you were already in position to take him down when he came to collect me? The idea has merit from a tactical standpoint, Minseek said slowly, ignoring Jaiwan's sharp look. But the risk to you would be enormous. Everything about this situation has enormous risk, Mira pointed out. At least this way, we're controlling the variables instead of just reacting to them. Jaiwan was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with internal conflict. She could practically see him weighing strategy against personal feelings, professional necessity against the desire to keep her safe. Modified version, he said finally. You help with the setup, but you're nowhere near the actual confrontation. They spent the next 2 hours planning what Taehyun cheerfully called their most complicated operation in months. Mira found herself genuinely useful, her outsider perspective catching details the men missed, her English teaching background helping them craft communications that would convince Kim Young-ho's organization. By afternoon, she felt more like a team member than a protected asset. The men had stopped treating her like delicate cargo and started including her in their casual conversation. When Seekjin made a joke about her blue eyes bringing them better planning luck than they'd had in years, it felt like acceptance rather than mockery. You're good at this, Jaiwan murmured during a break in planning, his hand finding the small of her back as they stood reviewing surveillance footage. Good at what? Seeing patterns others miss. Understanding people. Being part of a team. His voice dropped lower, meant only for her ears. Being exactly what we need. The warmth in his voice sent heat spiraling through her body. She turned to face him, suddenly very aware that they were standing close enough to share breath. What happens after we deal with Kim Young-ho? She asked. We figure out what comes next. Together. The promise in his voice made her stomach flutter. Together. When was the last time she'd been part of it together that felt like it might actually last? That evening, after the planning was complete and security measures were in place, Jaiwan knocked on her bedroom door. Come in, she called, looking up from the book she'd been failing to read for the past hour. He entered carrying 2 glasses of wine and wearing an expression that was somehow both confident and uncertain. I thought you might want company. Mira set her book aside and accepted the wine, acutely aware of the way his fingers brushed hers during the exchange. Always. They sat on the bed together, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the way his dress shirt stretched across his shoulders. The wine was expensive, smooth and complex in a way that reminded her this man had wealth and power beyond anything she'd ever experienced. Are you sure about tomorrow? He asked quietly. As sure as I can be about anything in this situation. She took another sip of wine, using the time to gather her courage. Are you sure about this? About us? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. When he kissed her this time, there was nothing careful or restrained about it. His mouth moved against hers with heat and hunger, one hand tangling in her hair while the other pulled her closer against his body. Mira felt her carefully maintained composure dissolve under the intensity of his attention. She'd never wanted anyone the way she wanted Jaiwan. The need was overwhelming, electric, making her bold in ways she'd never been before. When she tugged at his shirt, he helped her remove it, then stilled to let her explore the lean strength of his chest and shoulders. Beautiful, she whispered, tracing the scar along his ribs with gentle fingers. Not as beautiful as you. His voice was rough with desire as he drew her closer. Are you sure about this? Yes. The word came out breathless, but certain. I want this. I want you. What followed was everything she'd never known she was missing. Jaiwan touched her like she was precious, like he wanted to memorize every curve and response. He took his time despite the obvious strain of his control, making sure she was ready, making sure she wanted every step of their progression. When he finally moved inside her, it was with a reverence that made tears prick the corners of her eyes. This wasn't just physical connection, it was emotional claiming, a declaration that they belonged to each other in ways that transcended logic or safety. Afterward, she lay against his chest listening to his heartbeat and marveling at how completely her life had changed. 3 days ago, she'd been a lonely English teacher trying to blend into a culture that would never quite accept her. Now she was wrapped in the arms of a dangerous man who looked at her like she was a miracle. I love you, Jaiwan said quietly into the darkness. The words should have scared her. Instead, they felt like the most natural thing in the world. I love you too. His arms tightened around her, and she could feel some of his tension ease. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The phone call came at 4 a.m. Jaiwan answered on the second ring, his voice immediately alert despite having been deep asleep. The conversation was rapid Korean, but Mira caught enough words to understand that something was very wrong. What is it? She asked as he ended the call. They have my grandmother. Kim Young-ho's people took her an hour ago. The bottom dropped out of her stomach. Oh God. I'm so sorry. This is because of me, isn't it? This is because Kim Young-ho wants leverage. His voice was deadly calm, but she could see the fury building in his eyes. He thinks having her will make me careless. What are we going to do? We're going to get her back. And then we're going to end this permanently. Mira sat up, pushing her hair back from her face. I'm coming with you. No, absolutely not. This just became exponentially more dangerous. She's family to me too now. I'm not sitting here while the woman who called me blessed is in danger because of something I witnessed. Jaiwan stared at her for a long moment, conflict clear in his expression. Then his phone rang again, and the conversation that followed included several mentions of her name and blue eyes. What did they say? Mira asked when he hung up. Kim Young-ho specifically asked about the blue-eyed witness. He wants to see you personally. Then we use that. She climbed out of bed and started getting dressed with determined efficiency. We stick to the original plan, but now the stakes are higher. Mira. Jaiwan's voice stopped her mid-motion. If something happens to you, nothing's going to happen to me. Because I have you, and your team, and apparently good luck that your grandmother believes in. She crossed the room to cup his face in both hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Trust me the way I've learned to trust you. Let me be your partner instead of just your responsibility. When he finally nodded, she knew something fundamental had shifted between them. They weren't protector and protected anymore. They were equals choosing to face danger together. 2 hours later, as they finalized the rescue plan with his team, Seekjin looked up from his equipment check and grinned. Lucky Blue really is changing our fortune, he said in careful English. Best intel we've had in months, and now we know exactly where they're keeping the old woman. Mira felt warmth spread through her chest at the casual acceptance in his voice. For the first time in her life, being different felt like an advantage instead of a burden. She was exactly where she belonged. The warehouse district at dawn was eerily quiet, shadows stretching long between industrial buildings as morning light filtered through Seoul's perpetual haze. Mira adjusted the wire hidden beneath her jacket and tried to ignore the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. You remember the signal? Jaiwan asked for the third time, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. 2 clicks on the transmitter if I'm in immediate danger. 3 clicks when I've located your grandmother. Continuous signal when you should move in. She met his eyes, seeing her own fear reflected there. I've got this. His hand found her face, thumb stroking across her cheekbone in a gesture that was becoming familiar. If anything goes wrong, it won't. But Myra's voice was steadier than she felt. Kim Young-ho wants to see the blue-eyed witness who's been causing him so much trouble. He's expecting someone scared and helpless. Instead, he's getting someone who knows exactly how dangerous she is, Taehyun said from his position near the van. Lucky Blue is about to live up to her reputation. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Mira would approach the warehouse where Kim Young-ho was holding Jaiwan's grandmother, presenting herself as a witness ready to surrender in exchange for the old woman's safety. While their attention was focused on her, Jaiwan's team would position themselves for a coordinated assault that would leave Kim Young-ho's organization leaderless and scattered. What could go wrong? Everything. Mira walked toward the warehouse in trance with measured steps, her hands visible and empty. 2 guards flanked the door, their eyes tracking her approach with the lazy attention of predators who knew their prey had no choice but to come to them. I'm here to see Kim Young-ho, she said in careful Korean. I understand he wants to speak with me. The guards exchanged glances. One spoke into a radio while the other patted her down with professional thoroughness. They found the wire immediately. Expecting company? The first guard asked in accented English. Insurance, Mira replied. If I disappear, the police know where to look. It was a lie, but a believable one. They confiscated the wire and her phone before escorting her into the warehouse's cavernous interior. Kim Young-ho waited in the center of the space, flanked by a dozen men in dark suits. He was smaller than she'd expected from the surveillance photos, maybe 5'8" with the kind of compact build that suggested coiled energy rather than raw strength. But his eyes were cold as winter, and when he smiled at her approach, Mira felt ice crystallize in her stomach. The famous blue-eyed witness, he said in perfect English. You're smaller than I expected. People often underestimate me. Clearly. His gaze moved over her face with calculating interest. Do you know why you're here? You have someone I care about, and you want something I can provide. Information. Testimony. The complete destruction of Kang Jaiwan's organization. Kim Young-ho gestured toward a chair that had been placed in the open space. Sit. We have much to discuss. Where is she? Mira remained standing, meeting his stare with as much courage as she could summon. Where's his grandmother? Kim Young-ho snapped his fingers, and two guards disappeared into the warehouse's deeper shadows. They returned a moment later with a small figure that made Myra's chest tight with relief and fury. Jaiwon's grandmother looked fragile but unbroken, her silver hair still neat despite obvious exhaustion. Her eyes found Myra's immediately, and something that might have been approval flickered across her weathered features. "The blue-eyed girl," she said in English, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I told them you would come. I couldn't leave you here." "Of course not. Family protects family." The simple statement sent warmth through Myra's chest, even as Kim Young-ho's expression darkened with impatience. "How touching," he said. "But you're here for business, not reunions. The old woman's safety depends on your cooperation. What do you want me to tell you?" "Everything. Kong Jaiwon's operations, his associates, his weaknesses. In return, you both walk away from this alive." Mira pretended to consider the offer while her eyes swept the warehouse interior, cataloging positions and escape routes. 12 men plus Kim Young-ho. Too many for a direct confrontation, but manageable if Jaiwon's team could create the right kind of chaos. "And if I refuse? Then you watch her die before you join her." Kim Young-ho's smile was glacier cold. "I'm not a patient man, Miss Chun." Before Mira could respond, one of the guards approached Kim Young-ho and whispered something urgent in Korean. Whatever he said made the crime boss's expression shift from confident control to sharp concern. "It seems your boyfriend is more resourceful than expected," Kim Young-ho said. "My perimeter guards aren't responding to check-ins." Mira felt her pulse spike with hope and terror in equal measure. Jaiwon was moving ahead of schedule, which meant something had gone wrong with the original plan. "He'll come for us," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I'm counting on it." Kim Young-ho drew a pistol from his jacket, the metal gleaming dull in the warehouse's industrial lighting. "When he arrives, you're going to convince him to surrender. Otherwise, his precious grandmother dies slowly and painfully while he watches." The next few minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by sporadic radio chatter as Kim Young-ho's remaining men tried to establish contact with their missing perimeter. Mira used the time to work her way closer to where the grandmother sat tied to a metal chair, ostensibly out of nervous energy, but actually positioning herself for what she hoped would come next. The first explosion came from the warehouse's east wall, a controlled blast that sent smoke and debris rolling through the space. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power cut out, casting everything in hellish red shadows. In the chaos that followed, Mira moved. She dove toward the grandmother's chair, her fingers finding the knife she'd hidden in her boot during the planning session. The zip ties holding the old woman parted with a sharp snap. "Can you run?" Mira asked urgently. "Better than these young idiots think," the grandmother replied with grim satisfaction. The warehouse erupted into a battlefield as Jaiwon's team poured through multiple entry points. Gunfire echoed off the concrete walls while smoke grenades turned visibility into a deadly guessing game. Mira grabbed the grandmother's arm and headed for the nearest exit, only to find their path blocked by two of Kim Young-ho's men. "The blue eyes," one of them said in Korean, his voice sharp with superstitious fear. "She's cursed. Look what happened as soon as she arrived." His companion was already backing away, muttering what sounded like prayers. Whatever Kim Young-ho's organization believed about blue eyes and bad luck, seeing Mira in the middle of their collapsing operation was clearly confirming their worst fears. She used their hesitation to duck past them, pulling the grandmother toward a side door that led to an external loading dock. But before they could reach it, Kim Young-ho's voice cut through the chaos. "Stop right there, or I start shooting hostages." The fighting in the warehouse ceased immediately. Through the smoke and dim lighting, Mira could see Jaiwon 20 feet away, his weapon trained on Kim Young-ho's position. The crime boss stood behind partial cover near the warehouse's center, his own gun pressed against the head of one of his own men who'd apparently chosen the wrong moment to try fleeing. "Let them go," Jaiwon called. "Your fight is with me. My fight is with anyone who interferes with my business." Kim Young-ho's eyes found Mira through the smoky air. "But I'm feeling generous. Send me the blue-eyed witness, and everyone else walks away alive." Jaiwon's gaze met Myra's across the warehouse floor, and she could see the desperate calculation in his expression. He was actually considering it, weighing her life against the lives of his men and his grandmother. "No," Mira said clearly. Absolutely not. You don't have a choice, Kim Young-ho replied. Unless you want to watch everyone you care about die. But Mira was already moving, not toward Kim Young-ho, but toward the emergency lighting controls she'd spotted during the initial chaos. Her fingers found the master switch just as she heard Kim Young-ho shout for his men to stop her. The warehouse plunged into absolute darkness. What followed lasted maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. Gunfire strobed in the blackness while men shouted orders in Korean and English. Mira pressed herself against the wall and tried to track the sounds of combat, her heart hammering as she waited for someone to turn the lights back on. When emergency power finally restored minimal lighting, the warehouse had transformed. Kim Young-ho's men were down or fleeing, their organization's command structure shattered beyond repair. And in the center of the space, Kim Young-ho himself lay motionless beside the overturned chair where his hostage had been tied. Jaewon appeared out of the shadows like an avenging angel, his weapon still drawn as he scanned for remaining threats. When his eyes found Mira, the relief that crossed his face was so profound it made her chest tight with emotion. "Are you hurt?" He was beside her in seconds, his hands checking for wounds with the thorough attention of someone genuinely terrified of losing her. "I'm fine. We're both fine." Mira looked toward where his grandmother stood brushing dust from her hanbok with the dignified composure of someone who'd survived worse than kidnapping by amateur criminals. "Blue eyes bring protection," the grandmother said with satisfaction. "I told them you were dangerous, but they didn't listen." The cleanup took another hour. Kim Young-ho's surviving men disappeared into Seoul's underground, their organization's power structure too damaged to pose future threats. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but by the time they arrived, the warehouse would be empty except for evidence of a gang war that had resolved itself without requiring official intervention. Jaewon's team worked with practiced efficiency, ensuring nothing could be traced back to their organization, while Mira sat with the grandmother on a loading dock and tried to process what had just happened. "You did well," the old woman said quietly. "Jaewon chose correctly when he decided to trust you. I thought I was going to get everyone killed, but you didn't. You used the gifts you were given to protect the people you love. That is what family does." Family. The word still felt new and precious when applied to her own life. But looking at Jaewon as he coordinated the final stages of their operation, seeing the way his team treated her as one of their own, Mira realized she'd finally found where she belonged. When the warehouse was secure and they were back at the safe house, Jaewon pulled her aside into the quiet of the apartment's main room. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind exhaustion and the kind of emotional vulnerability that followed surviving something terrible together. "Marry me," he said without preamble. Mira blinked, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "I know it's fast. I know this whole situation is insane, but I can't imagine my life without you in it." His hands found her face, framing it with gentle reverence. "You're the bravest, most incredible woman I've ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt your own worth again." The proposal was so perfectly him that Mira felt tears prick her eyes. Direct and honest and completely overwhelming in the best possible way. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Because once I say yes, you're stuck with a half-Korean woman with weird eyes who calls the police when she sees people getting beaten up in alleys. Those weird eyes saved my grandmother's life tonight." His thumb brushed away the tear that had escaped despite her efforts. "And that woman who calls police when she sees injustice is exactly who I want beside me for whatever comes next." "Yes," Mira said, the word coming out fierce with certainty. "Yes, I'll marry you." When he kissed her, it was with the desperate relief of someone who'd been granted something beyond his wildest hopes. In the background, she could hear his grandmother speaking to the team in rapid Korean. But all that mattered was the man holding her like she was the most precious thing in his world. Later, as they lay together in the safety of his bed, Jaewon traced patterns on her bare shoulder with gentle fingers. "My grandmother says blue eyes brought me home and brought me love," he murmured against her hair. "What do you think?" "I think I've been waiting my entire life for you to walk into that alley. Everything else was just preparation for the moment when I could finally see myself the way you see me." Mira turned in his arms, studying his face in the dim light. "And how do I see you?" "Like I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be. In the morning, there would be plans to make and a future to build together. But tonight, wrapped in the arms of the man who'd taught her to see her differences as gifts rather than flaws. Mira-chan finally understood what it meant to be exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, Mira stood before the traditional wedding altar in Jaiwan's grandmother's garden, wearing a hanbok of deep red silk that had belonged to his mother. The morning sun caught the gold embroidery along the hem as she waited for her soon-to-be husband to complete the ceremonial bowing that would make them family in the eyes of Korean tradition. Everything about this moment felt like a dream. The carefully arranged chrysanthemums, the low table set with traditional foods, the handful of guests who had become more precious to her than any family she'd ever known. Taehyun stood as Jaiwan's witness, grinning broadly despite his attempts at ceremonial solemnity. Seokjin and Minsik flanked the altar with their wives, all of them beaming like proud relatives. But it was Jaiwan's grandmother who commanded the ceremony, her voice strong and clear as she recited blessings that stretched back through generations of Korean tradition. She wore her finest hanbok, midnight blue with silver threads that caught the light like stars' cape, and when her eyes met Myra's, they were bright with satisfaction. "Blue eyes bring protection to this family," she said in Korean, then repeated in English for Myra's benefit. "Blue eyes bring love where there was loneliness, courage where there was fear, hope where there was only darkness." Jaiwan looked magnificent in his traditional wedding clothes, the deep blue of his hanbok bringing out the gold flecks in his dark eyes. When he turned to face her for the final vows, Mira felt her breath catch at the reverence in his expression. "Ready, Mrs. Kong?" he asked quietly, using her married name for the first time. "Ready," she whispered back. The kiss that sealed their marriage was soft and sweet, full of promise rather than passion. But when Jaiwan's hands framed her face afterward, his thumb stroking across her cheekbones, Mira saw a future stretching ahead of them that was everything she'd never dared to imagine. The celebration continued long into the afternoon, traditional Korean music mixing with laughter and the comfortable chaos of a family gathering. Mira found herself passed from embrace to embrace, each of Jaiwan's associates offering congratulations that felt genuinely warm rather than perfunctory. "Lucky Blue finally made it official," Taehyun said when it was his turn to hug her. "Best thing that ever happened to any of us." It was true in ways that went beyond superstition. In the months since Kim Young-ho's death, Jaiwan's organization had undergone a transformation that none of them could have predicted. The move toward legitimate business ventures had accelerated, partly because the threat that had driven them underground was gone, but mostly because Myra's presence had given Jaiwan a reason to want a different kind of future. Kong Enterprises now operated a chain of language schools throughout Seoul, with Mira serving as the educational director for their English programs. What had started as a cover for money laundering had become a genuinely successful business, one that employed half a dozen former gang members as security staff and administrative personnel. The transition hadn't been seamless. There were still aspects of Jaiwan's business that operated in legal gray areas, still moments when his phone rang with calls that required coded language and careful responses. But the violence was largely behind them, replaced by the kinds of negotiations that happened in boardrooms rather than back alleys. Mira loved the work more than she'd expected. Teaching English to the children of Jaiwan's associates had revealed a talent for curriculum development she'd never known she possessed. Watching former criminals struggle through pronunciation exercises while their kids giggled at their mistakes had become one of her favorite parts of each week. But more than the professional satisfaction, it was the sense of belonging that made everything worthwhile. These people who had once been strangers united only by shared danger had become her chosen family in the truest sense. "Mrs. Kong," a voice said behind her as the wedding celebration was winding down. Mira turned to find Mrs. Park, an elderly woman from the neighborhood who had initially been suspicious of the young foreigner with unusual eyes. Now Mrs. Park's expression was respectful, almost reverent, as she approached with her teenage granddaughter in tow. "We wanted to thank you for the English tutoring," Mrs. Park continued. "Sooyoung's grades have improved so much since she started your classes." The granddaughter bowed politely, her eyes wide with the same fascination that had once made Mira uncomfortable. But now when people stared at her blue eyes, it was with admiration rather than suspicion. "My grandmother says you have blessed eyes," Sooyoung said in careful English. "That you bring good fortune to everyone you meet." "Your grandmother is very kind," Mira replied in Korean, then switched to English for practice. How is your college preparation going? Very good. I want to study international business. Maybe someday I can have eyes like yours that help me succeed in global markets. The casual way the teenager linked blue eyes with professional success would have seemed absurd a year ago. Now it was simply part of Myra's daily reality. Somewhere in the past 6 months, she'd gone from being a curiosity to being a local celebrity, the foreign woman whose marriage to Kang Jaiwan had brought prosperity and stability to their entire district. It was a strange kind of fame, but one that felt earned rather than accidental. As the last guests departed and the garden settled into evening quiet, Mira found herself helping clean up alongside Jaiwan's grandmother. The older woman moved with careful precision, wrapping leftover food and arranging flowers with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd hosted countless family gatherings. Happy? The grandmother asked as they worked. Incredibly happy. Mira folded one of the ceremonial cloths, her wedding ring catching the light from the paper lanterns. Thank you for today. For all of this. Thank you for bringing my grandson home to himself. The grandmother's eyes were warm as they met Myra's. And for giving this old woman hope for great-grandchildren who will carry the protection of blue eyes into the next generation. The comment sent heat blooming in Myra's cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or anticipation she couldn't say. She and Jaiwan had talked about children in abstract terms, but hearing his grandmother speak about it with such certainty made the possibility feel immediate and real. Later that evening, after the ceremonial clothes had been carefully stored and the last dishes had been cleaned, Mira sat in their bedroom brushing her hair while Jaiwan changed out of his formal wear. The apartment they'd moved into was larger than the safe house, with windows that offered a view of both Seoul's modern skyline and the traditional neighborhood where his grandmother lived. It was the perfect representation of their life together, rooted in tradition but reaching toward the future, Korean and international, dangerous and safe, all at the same time. Come here, Jaiwan said softly from where he sat on the edge of their bed. Mira set down her brush and crossed the room to stand between his knees, her hands settling naturally on his shoulders. Even after all these months, touching him still sent electricity through her system. The desire had only grown stronger as their emotional connection deepened. Mrs. Kong, he murmured, his hands finding her waist. How does it feel to be officially part of the family? Like coming home. When he pulled her down onto the bed, it was with the reverent attention she'd come to expect from him. Jaiwan touched her like she was something precious, like he still couldn't quite believe she'd chosen to stay. The intensity of his focus made her feel beautiful in ways that went beyond physical appearance. Their lovemaking was different now than it had been in those first desperate weeks. Less urgent, but no less passionate, marked by the deep intimacy that came from truly knowing another person. When Jaiwan moved inside her, it was with the confidence of someone who understood exactly how to make her come apart in his arms. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the moonlight filtering through their bedroom windows, Myra's head pillowed on Jaiwan's chest, while his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. I have something to tell you, she said quietly. His hand stilled. Good or bad? Good. Very good. Mira lifted her head to meet his eyes, suddenly nervous despite their intimacy. I'm pregnant. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then Jaiwan's face transformed with a joy so profound it made her chest tight with emotion. Are you sure? I took 3 tests yesterday. Then saw a doctor this morning while you were at the office. Jaiwan sat up abruptly, pulling her with him so he could frame her face in both hands. His eyes were bright with unshed tears as he studied her expression. How do you feel about it? He asked, terrified and thrilled and completely overwhelmed. She leaned into his touch, feeling the last of her anxiety dissolve under his obvious happiness. How do you feel? Like the luckiest man alive. His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, the gesture achingly familiar. Blue-eyed babies, he said wonderingly. My grandmother is going to lose her mind with excitement. The prediction proved accurate. When they told her the next morning, Jaiwan's grandmother immediately began making plans for expanding the family shrine and preparing traditional pregnancy foods. She also announced her intention to teach the baby Korean lullabies and protection prayers from the moment of birth. Blue eyes and Kong blood, she said with deep satisfaction. This child will be blessed beyond measure. 3 months later, Mira walked through the traditional market in Hongdae, where she'd once felt like an outsider, her growing belly drawing smiles and blessings from vendors who had become familiar faces. She was picking up ingredients for dinner when she heard the comment that would have devastated her a year earlier. "Look at those blue eyes," a teenage girl whispered to her friend as they passed. "Do you think if I got colored contacts like that, I'd be as lucky as she is?" Her friend rolled her eyes. "You can't fake blessed eyes, stupid. That's why they're special." Mira smiled and continued shopping, one hand resting protectively on her stomach where their daughter was growing strong and healthy. The baby's gender had been confirmed just the week before, along with the doctor's cheerful observation that the child would likely have her mother's distinctive eyes. She was just leaving the market when she heard her name called in a familiar voice. "Mira, wait up." She turned to find David Kim, an American expat teacher she'd met during her first weeks in Seoul. He'd been one of the few foreigners who'd bothered being friendly to the obviously mixed-race woman who stood out even among other foreign residents. David jogged up with a grin, his eyes immediately dropping to her obvious pregnancy. "Wow, congratulations. I heard you got married, but I had no idea you were expecting." "Thank you." Mira found herself genuinely happy to see him. "How are you? Still teaching at the international school?" "Actually, I'm moving back to the States next month. New job in San Francisco. But before I go, I wanted to tell you how amazing you look. Like, genuinely amazing. You're practically glowing." "Pregnancy will do that," Mira said with a laugh. "It's not just the pregnancy, though. You seem so confident now, so settled. Remember when we first met and you were convinced you'd never fit in anywhere?" David shook his head in apparent amazement. "Look at you now. Beautiful wife, successful business, baby on the way, and half the neighborhood treats you like some kind of good luck charm. Things have definitely changed. I'll say, your husband is a lucky man." Actually, Jaiwan appeared at her elbow as if summoned by the conversation, his arms sliding around her waist with the possessive protectiveness that had become second nature. His smile was polite, but his eyes held a warning that David was wise enough to heed. "Jaiwan, this is David Kim, an old friend from the international teaching community. David, this is my husband." The two men shook hands with the careful politeness of territorial animals acknowledging each other's presence. David made appropriate congratulations about the pregnancy and promised to send a gift from America before excusing himself with obvious relief. "Old friend?" Jaiwan asked as they watched David disappear into the market crowd. "Very old, very platonic friend who's moving to a different continent," Mira assured him. "Are you jealous?" "Only when other men look at you like they're wondering what it would be like to be married to someone with lucky blue eyes." Mira laughed and stood on her toes to kiss him properly, not caring about the public display of affection. "I only have lucky blue eyes for one man." "Good." His arms tightened around her, careful of her growing belly. "Because I have plans for those eyes that involve the next 60 years or so." "Only 60 years. Fine. Forever." His expression grew serious as he studied her face. "You know that, right? That this is forever for me. Forever for me, too." They walked home through the bustling streets of Seoul as the sun set behind the city's modern skyline. Mira felt their daughter kick as if responding to her parents' voices, and she rested her free hand on her stomach while Jaiwan's arm stayed secure around her waist. A year ago, she'd been a lonely teacher convinced she'd never truly belong anywhere. Now she was part of a family, part of a community, part of something larger and more meaningful than she'd ever imagined possible. Her blue eyes, once a source of shame and isolation, had become a symbol of protection and good fortune that people sought out rather than avoided. As they climbed the steps to their apartment building, Mira caught their reflection in the glass doors. A pregnant Korean-American woman with blue eyes, walking beside a tall Korean man whose expensive suit couldn't hide the dangerous grace in his movements. They looked like exactly what they were, partners who had found their perfect match in the most unlikely circumstances. "What are you thinking about?" Jaiwan asked as they waited for the elevator. "How much I love my life. How grateful I am for that night when I decided to help strangers in an alley instead of minding my own business. Best decision you ever made?" "Second best." The elevator arrived, and they stepped inside together. "The best decision was saying yes when you asked me to marry you." When the elevator doors closed, Jaiwan pulled her into his arms for a kiss that tasted like promises and forever. Outside, Seoul glittered with possibility, But inside the small space they'd created together, Mira Chin Kong was exactly where she belonged. Her blue eyes might have made her different, but they'd also made her exactly who she needed to be to find her way home to the life she was meant to live. And as their daughter kicked again, responding to her parents' happiness with movements that felt like celebration, Mira knew that being different had been the greatest gift she'd ever received. It had brought her love, family, purpose, and a future bright with possibility. It had brought her home.